There is a moment that happens so quietly it almost escapes notice. A moment where the idea of going out appears in your mind and is met not with resistance exactly, but with a soft internal settling, as if the decision has already been made somewhere beneath your awareness. Before you've argued with yourself, before you've listed reasons, before you've had a chance to decide, your body relaxes in the direction of staying home first, and only then does the mind catch up. That is the unsettling part. Not the choice itself, but how early the relief arrives, how little authorship you feel over it. You might tell yourself you're tired, or that you'll go out another day, or that you simply enjoy being at home more. All of these explanations feel calm, reasonable, even self-respecting. But notice how quickly they close the question. Notice how fast curiosity disappears once comfort is named. The danger here is not isolation or introversion or preference. The danger is how easily the mind learns to confuse relief with truth. From the outside, loving to stay at home looks like a lifestyle. From the inside, it often feels like alignment, like finally listening to yourself instead of forcing something unnatural. And yet, alignment that arrives without friction deserves scrutiny. The mind is very good at building stories that protect the nervous system from discomfort. Thoughts appear that frame the outside world as loud, chaotic, demanding, while the inside becomes quiet, predictable, safe. Those thoughts generate ease. That ease reinforces the behavior of staying in. And over time, repetition begins to harden into identity. You stop saying, "I'm staying home tonight," and start saying, "I'm someone who likes staying home." The shift is subtle, but it matters because identity does more than describe behavior. It defends it. Once something feels like who you are, questioning it begins to feel unnecessary, even disloyal. What makes this pattern so difficult to see is that it doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels intelligent. You may believe you're simply selective with your energy, more reflective than others, less interested in shallow stimulation. These interpretations are not false, but they are incomplete. They explain the comfort without asking what the comfort is doing. Every time staying home resolves a faint unease, the system learns. Thoughts generate emotional forecasts. Those forecasts bias behavior, and the resulting behavior quietly confirms a self-image that feeds back into the next thought. Nothing dramatic happens. No crisis announces itself. The training occurs in silence, in ordinary evenings, in choices that feel too small to matter. Over time, something shifts in how the outside world is experienced, not because it has changed, but because your tolerance has. The idea of going out begins to feel heavier than it used to, more effortful in advance. You may assume this means you've finally figured yourself out, but consider another possibility: that your nervous system has learned to associate stillness with safety and unpredictability with cost, regardless of actual danger. When relief becomes the primary signal you trust, it quietly takes authority away from curiosity. And the longer this pattern runs uninterrupted, the more normal it feels, which is precisely why it becomes difficult to question. Because by the time you notice that staying home no longer feels like a choice, the comfort will already feel like evidence that it's who you are. Once a pattern like this settles in, it doesn't remain a private preference contained to a single evening. It begins to reorganize perception itself. Staying home quietly becomes the reference point, the baseline against which everything else is measured. The outside world starts to feel louder, heavier, more effortful in advance, not because it has objectively changed, but because your nervous system has. Thoughts arise that frame leaving as inefficient, draining, unnecessary, while staying in feels economical, controlled, sensible. Those thoughts generate a subtle tightening in the body. That tightening makes staying home feel like the intelligent option. And every time that option dissolves discomfort, the system learns again. This is not a conscious decision to withdraw. It is adaptation doing what adaptation does best, reducing friction before it has to be felt. Over time, This adaptation begins to shape identity in ways that feel invisible precisely because they feel reasonable. You don't think of yourself as someone avoiding the outside world. You think of yourself as someone who knows their limits, who understands their energy, who doesn't force what feels unnatural. You become selective, intentional, self-aware. But notice what quietly changes beneath that language. The range of situations you consider tolerable narrows. Invitations require more internal negotiation than they used to. Spontaneity feels less neutral, more intrusive. None of this registers as loss because nothing is taken away. There is no rupture, no conflict. The shift arrives as refinement, as clarity, as maturity. And because it reduces discomfort, it feels aligned with who you are becoming. This is where the system crosses an invisible line. The outside world is no longer encountered on its own terms. It is evaluated in advance. Your mind generates forecasts about how tiring something will be, how awkward it might feel, how much effort it will require before anything has actually happened. Those forecasts produce emotional weight ahead of experience. That weight biases behavior toward staying home, and the behavior confirms the belief that home is where you function best. The loop tightens quietly, not because the outside world proved itself hostile, but because the inside world remained reliably soothing. Relief becomes the signal you trust most, and curiosity slowly loses authority as a guide. What makes this difficult to question is that nothing feels wrong. There is no obvious loneliness, no dramatic dissatisfaction, no clear regret. Life simply becomes smaller in a way that feels efficient. The internal world grows more familiar and manageable, while the external world becomes something you prepare for rather than inhabit. You may call this peace, and it may feel peaceful, but peace achieved through narrowing carries a hidden condition. It depends on continued avoidance of states you no longer feel equipped to carry. The more staying home functions as emotional regulation, the more leaving home begins to feel like dysregulation. And once that association forms, the system will protect it automatically, without consulting intention. This is the uncomfortable implication you are left with here. What feels like preference may already be structure. What feels like self-knowledge may already be conditioning. And if that is true, then the question is no longer whether staying home is good or bad, healthy or unhealthy. The question is what has been quietly reorganized around that comfort, and whether you would even recognize the cost if it never announced itself as loss. There is, however, a weakness built into any system that relies on prediction rather than contact, and it doesn't announce itself as a problem. It appears as a subtle distortion in timing. The discomfort that keeps you inside does not actually live in the act of going out. It lives before it. It lives in anticipation, in the rehearsal, in the moment the idea forms and the nervous system reacts as if the experience has already happened. This is why the relief of staying home arrives so early. The system is not responding to reality. It is responding to an internal forecast. And forecasts, no matter how convincing they feel, are not experiences. They are simulations. The mind is excellent at simulating discomfort in advance, but far less accurate at predicting how the body adapts once something is underway. This creates a quiet contradiction. The system depends on you not noticing. The intensity you are avoiding is front-loaded, while the experience itself often distributes that intensity differently once it begins. The system protects you from what it imagines, not from what actually unfolds. This is why the most uncomfortable moment is rarely the event itself. It is the threshold, the point of initiation, the moment before motion, before contact, before the nervous system has evidence that its predictions may be exaggerated. Once movement begins, something shifts, the body adjusts, attention reorganizes, sensation replaces speculation. This does not mean the experience becomes pleasant, easy, or even enjoyable. It means the anticipated weight does not arrive all at once the way the mind insisted it would. The system knows this at some level, which is precisely why it works so hard to prevent initiation. Because initiation produces evidence, and evidence is dangerous to a structure built on prediction. This is the part most people misunderstand. They assume the system is protecting them from difficulty. It isn't. It is protecting itself from contradiction. As long as anticipation remains untested, the internal model stays intact. Staying home preserves the narrative. Leaving introduces variables, and variables threaten coherence. This is why the resistance appears before you have time to think. If the mind waited until experience, it would lose control. So it intervenes early, with sensation, with heaviness, with a convincing sense that you already know how this will feel. That sense is not insight. It is conditioning asserting itself. At this point, it can be tempting to believe that recognizing this contradiction is enough. That if you simply understand that anticipation exaggerates cost, the system will loosen its grip. But understanding is not the same as interruption. In some cases, awareness sharpens the system's defenses. The mind learns to narrate its own avoidance more convincingly. It refines the forecasts. It becomes better at justifying why this time is different. The structure does not collapse when exposed. It adapts. And yet, the contradiction remains. A system that relies on preventing contact cannot fully control what happens once contact occurs. It can only delay it. This is not encouragement. It is exposure. A quiet acknowledgement that the authority you have been living under is not as absolute as it feels, and that its greatest power lies not in what happens when you act, but in how thoroughly it convinces you not to begin. Once this contradiction is exposed, the system does not retreat. It adjusts. It learns to defend itself not by denying the crack, but by relocating the threat. What once felt like fear of going out transforms into something subtler and harder to name, a vigilance around repetition. The first time initiation slips through, it feels accidental, almost inconsequential. The body adapts. The predicted weight does not arrive in the way it was rehearsed, but the system is paying attention. It registers that something occurred without the usual safeguards, and it recalibrates. The next time, the discomfort arrives earlier, heavier, not as anticipation of the event itself, but as a warning about what this moment might signify. Because now, initiation is no longer just contact, it is precedent, and precedent threatens structure. This is where many people become confused. They assume the system resists difficulty in proportion to effort. It doesn't. It resists in proportion to identity threat. The issue is not how hard the action is, but how visible it is as evidence. Once the system senses that initiation can occur without catastrophe, it shifts focus from the act to the meaning of the act. Silence stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling conspicuous. You begin to notice yourself noticing. Was that moment of contact spontaneous, or was it deliberate? Was that absence of explanation natural or strategic? Awareness turns inward and becomes surveillance. The mind monitors not just behavior, but intention itself. And under observation, even subtle movement feels louder than it is. This is why attempts to use the crack often fail. The moment leverage becomes recognizable, it becomes threatening. What once slipped through unnoticed now triggers the very defenses it bypassed. The system tightens not because the action was difficult, but because it was repeatable, because repetition implies change, and change implies instability in the identity that has been quietly built around predictability and control. The anxiety that follows is not about the outside world anymore. It is about coherence, about maintaining the story that has kept everything orderly and legible. At this stage, insight can feel corrosive rather than liberating. You understand too much to move innocently, and too little to move freely. You hesitate not because you are afraid of the experience, but because you are unsure what the movement would now represent. This is where many people retreat, not back into obvious avoidance, but into refinement, into better reasoning, more nuance, more careful explanations. The system regains stability by making movement conditional again, turning contact into something that must be justified rather than allowed. And yet, beneath all of this adaptation, the contradiction has not been resolved. It has only been covered. The system can delay contact, reinterpret it, and surround it with meaning. But it cannot eliminate the fact that its authority depends on keeping experience at a distance. The question that begins to form here is no longer about how to act, or when to act, or whether to act at all. It is about what happens when every attempt to locate authority collapses into more control, and whether the system can continue to function once the effort to manage it becomes the source of friction itself. At some point, without a clear moment of decision, the question of authority begins to lose its grip. Not because you have answered it, but because it no longer organizes experience in the way it once did. The effort to manage yourself, to predict reactions, to regulate discomfort in advance, starts to generate more friction than it resolves. Avoidance no longer feels neutral. It begins to carry its own weight, not as fear, not as guilt, but as a subtle tension that didn't exist before. The system that once protected you by narrowing now finds itself strained by the very narrowing it created. Staying home no longer delivers the same clean relief, because relief depended on contrast, on the idea that there was something being escaped. When the outside world has been reduced to a shadow of anticipation rather than a place of contact, avoidance loses efficiency. It starts to require explanation. An explanation, once automatic, begins to feel heavy. This is not a moment of empowerment. It does not feel like freedom. It feels strangely flat, even disorienting. The absence of internal pressure is not uplifting at first. It removes a familiar source of meaning. For a long time, effort and resistance provided structure. They told you who you were. When that structure weakens, there is a brief period where nothing rushes in to replace it. No new identity appears. No confident narrative forms. The system does not collapse into chaos, but it also does not immediately reorganize itself around intention. Instead, something quieter happens. Certain behaviors stop requiring justification. Certain explanations stop presenting themselves, not because you chose silence, but because the impulse to explain has thinned. What replaces control here is not willpower and not awareness, but inevitability. The system reorients not around what you should do, but around what is no longer worth maintaining. Explaining begins to cost more energy than not explaining. Staying home for the sake of regulation begins to feel inefficient, not morally wrong, not unhealthy, just unnecessary. The old pathways don't disappear dramatically. They lose urgency. You find yourself failing to produce the same anticipatory weight that once made avoidance automatic. The absence of struggle is not a victory. It is a reallocation. At this point, identity stops being the reference point it once was. You no longer ask whether you are someone who prefers staying home, or someone who avoids discomfort, or someone who has finally figured themselves out. Those questions stop doing useful work. Authority is not reclaimed. It is rendered irrelevant as a problem to solve. Experience is no longer filtered primarily through prediction or defense. Contact happens, not because you forced it, but because nothing rises to prevent it with the same conviction as before. The change, if it can be called that, does not announce itself. There is no sense of arrival, no closing statement, just a quiet recognition, after the fact, that something which once felt essential has become optional, and that much of what you mistook for preference was simply the mind doing its best to maintain a structure that no longer needs to be defended.